thank you to Maury for giving me space to write what I do and for people to read it. I'm really overwhelmed and honoured. So as Raymond said, I work as a salaried physician in general and acute medicine at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. They allow me to say that I work at the Alfred Hospital now. I had to get official sanction for that. It's a huge city hospital that's overflowing with the sick, particularly now in winter. The orthopaedic ward's full of people who got up for a glass of water and snapped their hip. The psychiatry ward's full of near suicides and phantom voices drilling holes in people's heads. Cardiac cath labs overflowing with heart attacks. Burns unit usually has one or two people who tipped a bucket of petrol over their head and struck a match. Hearts and lungs are plucked from the brain dead and sewn into the diseased. People crowd into the emergency department suffering because their organs are slowly failing the body that houses them. On the general medical unit in which I work, we house the frail and the elderly, the drunken, dispossessed and disabled, the self-harmed, starved and overdosed, and the diagnostic dilemmas. That said, most of my inpatients are old, but most old people aren't actually inpatients. 75% of those people who are aged over 85 live in their own homes with some or no support. And I've had patients, handful of patients, probably dozens actually, who are over 100 years old and still live at home independently. And this new longevity of ours, I think, is a triumph. But it's been turned into a threatening statistic, which has become a headline used to justify both austerity and what at times seems to approach frank disgust. 1 in 3 Australians will be old by the middle of the century. And how on earth will we cope with so few producers, taxpayers and consumers, with this swelling mass of greedy geezers, the grey tsunami of the sick and frail elderly who will be an emotional and financial burden on their families and societies, and whose infirmities will likely bankrupt the health system. What do we see when we pass someone who's slowly making their way down the street, maybe bent over, maybe a hand on a stick? Why do we reject on some pre-conscious level that inevitably, if we're lucky, that old person is what we will become? I can see how an individual or group with a different skin colour, religion, gender or sexual orientation may be kept by the racist, the homophobe or the misogynist in a position of other or alien. But with the old, our repugnance and lack of empathy seems a remarkable feat of denial, and one that's actually not ultimately self-serving at all. Last year, Joe Ibrahim, a geriatrician I know, wrote a coroner's department report into premature deaths in nursing homes. And when I mentioned Joe's report to a colleague, his face registered surprise, and he said, "Is it possible for a death in a nursing home to be premature?" And Joe told me, and I quote, "If it were happening in any other kind of institution to any other part of the population, workers say, or children, there'd be an outcry, media inquiries and swift intervention. The truth is we don't value the last months or years of an old person's life, particularly if they're in residential care." It's really not very hard to show that we devalue our elderly, are repulsed by them and terrified of becoming them. One of the most read articles in The Atlantic last year was Why I Hope to Die at 75 by a professor of bioethics, Ezekiel Emanuel. In it, he jauntily promotes the idea that it's a horror to grow old, that growing old necessarily involves the accumulation of disability, the transformation of a human subject into a wreck and a burden on family and society. And Emanuel, therefore, wishes to die early. And there's a picture of him, a man in his late 50s, radiating vitality, sitting with his feet up on the desk, long legs crossed, drinking from a cup that has printed on it "The Boss." And another picture shows him with his arms slung around his nephews, and they've just climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Accompanying the article is this pretty bright yellow graph that depicts the decline in one's productivity with increasing age. You know, Emmanuel knows his place, the boss, at the top of the mountain, at the peak of a very particular kind of productivity, and he would rather die than give that up. At the moment, he thinks that anyway. And if we're all just these economic units who lift or lean, then very little is lost when a nursing home resident or anyone getting on in their years dies prematurely. In fact, money will be saved. There's less nursing home beds to fund, and the kids can finally get their hands on the house. I think it's really important that we attend to our devaluing of the old, because this attitude that we have, I think, determines how governments, institutions and individuals act or fail to act. The first time that I see Irina, we're 2 doctors down and have a full waiting room. I call her name 4 times. Finally, she stands up. 94 years old and 125 centimetres tall. The clinic, which is one of 3 different public clinics that I work in, is for older patients with multiple chronic problems. They've got failing hearts, kidneys and lungs, dissolving bones and aching joints, or maybe their bone marrow's drying up. It's all just got a little bit too complicated for a GP to manage. And there's this desk between Irina and me, and I'm supposed to type notes directly into a computer as she talks, as if I'm a travel agent, because this is efficient. Though deaf, she whispers, and I look at her: cataracts, arthritis, stains on her cardigan, brown cardigan, false teeth that are miles too big for her gums, so they move up and down independently of her lips when she speaks. And I leave the desk and sit next to her so I can hear her. And her English is halting, slow as calligraphy. And I ask her if next time she comes, if she'd like me to get a Russian interpreter. And she looks at me and raises an eyebrow. Great eyebrow raiser she is. And she says, "You don't like my English?" And I ask her how she's been since the last time she came to the clinic. And she says what she says every time thereafter, because I made sure that I saw her, because I just loved her. She says, "I am 94, doctor, I am old." And she always pauses, because she's really theatrical. She pauses and raises a finger before delivering her punchline, which is, "But I am not dead yet." And then she always laughs. I sit beside her to feel her pulse or listen to her lungs, and she tells me snippets that over many months that I see her become these grand narratives. In Stalin's Russia, her husband was taken into a labour camp for running his own illegal business as a tailor, and they wouldn't let him take his violin into the camp. So for a year, this tiny woman travelled to the camp every week and demanded that they give him his violin. And she wrote letters to Stalin. And they actually eventually relented, and her husband took possession of his violin and played it so beautifully, she told me, that he was granted an unofficial reward. Though it was against the rules, Irina was allowed to stay in the labour camp for a week with him. And I know Irina is on her way to a nursing home when I sit next to her doing something clinical one day, and she whispers in her ancient staccato, "Doctor, this week I dirtied myself 2 times." Once patients enter a nursing home due to some tweak or random thing about funding, they're no longer eligible to attend this clinic. It's another world when you're in a nursing home and all the rules change. After she misses 2 appointments in a row, I find out she has actually been moved to a nursing home. And I feel sad and increasingly troubled by questions about the labour camp that I know only she can answer. And for some reason, the questions really nag at me. Did her husband have his own room? What was in it? Was there a window? Was the bed comfortable? What did they eat? Was she happy to be with him for that week? I start to feel this strange, low-level panic whenever I think of her. What was it like in the camp? So after clinic one day, I call the nursing home and I ask them to ask Irina if I might visit. She tells them to tell me to come the next day. So her room has a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a bar fridge and a single armchair. It's actually divided into two, so her part of the room has that, and then the next part of the narrow room has the same thing for someone else who wasn't there when I was there. And I sat on her walking frame and I asked her how she is. And she's old but not dead yet. And we laugh. She tells me that she fell and thought she was being taken to hospital, but instead found herself in this room. While I'm there, someone brings 1 cup of tea in a plastic mug, dark brown biscuit, and smiles at me over her head. And Irina dips her finger into the tea and then pushes it away. It's cold. When I stand up to leave, she asks me to wait a minute and she opens her fridge. And it's full of these brown biscuits all piled into the door shelves and the drawers. And she wraps a handful in a napkin and insists I take some. And she puts the parcel in my hands and says, "Will you come again?" We all know what the goal of a hospital admission is. It's to get people well or dead and out of the hospital as quickly as possible. But what's the goal of a nursing home? It's to house and care for someone until they die. But what does to care for someone mean? Hardly anyone wants to go to a nursing home. Many of my patients fear it. Families often feel terrible guilt when the time comes. It's just seen as an abandonment. Nursing homes are the places, or we think they're the places, where we place our bad outcomes, our frail, our no longer independence. There are places people go to safely wait to die, the old doubly incontinence. You might have stood up to Stalin and still read Tolstoy, but if you're losing it from the front and the back, then you're not a 2-year-old, then you're going to be hidden away. Most of the time, they perform their function as a holding bay for old people. And there are some rare, extraordinary facilities staffed by dedicated carers who treat their residents as individuals living in a real home or community, but they're rare. The nature of a nursing home, as with the nature of any kind of home or institution, is really dictated by its culture. And a handful of individuals create this culture: the manager, the nurses, the attendants, and the enactment of their values. There are these luxuriously appointed castles with top-of-the-range tiling and glasses of Shiraz with dinner that are militaristic or icy cold. And there are places that my social workers tell me they would not send a stray dog. In Australia, people currently live an average of 2.8 years once they're placed in a nursing home, but most die within 3 to 8 months. Residents go outside for an average of 96 seconds a day. Studies show that constant and severe loneliness is reported by up to 50% of residents. They're often told when they may eat, drink, wash, toilet, and go outside. False assumptions are made continually about what a person might like doing. Min ran an inner city boarding house for students in the late 1950s to the 90s. And she lived next door to the boarding house, and the two houses shared a backyard. She was generous and cared for the students and collected bottles and donated the money to Urella. Michael Cathcart, who's now an ABC radio broadcaster and historian, lived in this boarding house in the 1980s for 10 years while he was a student here at Melbourne Uni. And he describes Min as a spry and sharp lover of company and beer. She was usually cheerfully tipsy by 4 p.m, he says, and she was very well known in the local community, visited the Victoria Market a few times a week to buy her meat and vegetables from store holders who'd known her for decades. She drank at the local pub. In her late 80s, Min's health and mental state gradually started to decline. Instead of her caring for the students, they started to care for her, in particular Michael, who was completing his PhD, and his friend Victor, who also lived in the boarding house. She fell and fractured her hip and spent a few weeks in rehab and then came back to her home. and social workers intermittently visited the house. She failed all their cognitive tests and mixed up her words. She'd call her stick the bone, but everyone who lived in the house understood her. But the social workers were really worried. They said, "She's drinking beer. Have you seen the meat in her fridge? It's grey. She's in there boiling a cantaloupe." They told Michael she was at risk and needed to be placed in a nursing home. He said, "But what does it matter? 92 is a very risky thing to be, and this is how she wants to live." But her care needs grew and she became incontinent. Michael and Victor found themselves drawn gradually into her more intimate care. They'd get her out of bed in the morning, clean her up, and off she'd go, following her routine that she'd followed for a very long time, collect the bottles, visit the pub, visit her solicitor and the market, and she'd come home with food and prepare it. She became increasingly unsteady on her feet, so the pub substituted sarsaparilla for her beer, and she'd complain that it looked different to everyone else's, but, drank it. The store holders understood what she wanted, gave her the correct change, and she was propped up. It sounds like this utopian story, this woman propped up by this community, close-knit community. Michael said she'd lost vocabulary, was physically frail, but retained the spirit of a hero. And she wanted desperately to stay at home, and so this community rallied around her to enable it. And Michael says that the time he spent helping Min was one of the most important experiences of his life. He says that caring for her gave him so very much. Last year, there was a Senate inquiry into young disabled people living in aged care facilities. The aim of the inquiry was to examine how these young people could be provided with better individualised housing options, to see if they could be incorporated back into the community. The newspapers were full of, these stories that were full of outrage, and everyone agreed that it was appalling that these people in their 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s were being treated in this way, living in conditions of abject loneliness, trapped inside, being told when to eat and bathe. One woman said, quote, "As a mother with a child that now has a brain injury living in an aged care environment, it rips my heart out watching her sit in her chair in front of the TV all day," unquote. In all the outrage at the inhumanity of keeping the young in such places, there was this really telling blind spot. Not one commentator raised the question of why such conditions might suddenly become acceptable at the age of 65. No one commented on it. It was quite remarkable. And so with this ageist, because I can't really say that it's anything else, with this ageist backdrop rises this call, sort of hysterical call for euthanasia in Victoria at the moment. And it doesn't come from the economic rationalists, or not only from them, rather, and for reasons beyond my comprehension, it's become the darling issue of the progressives, to the point that people are puzzled to discover that I, a staunchly and openly far left progressive and atheist, am opposed to euthanasia. It's like they can't believe it. Don't I believe in an individual's right to die? Julie Landvot wrote an article in a Fairfax paper last year about her mother who has advanced dementia and lives in a nursing home. The article was a plea to, turn to page 9, allow euthanasia of those with advanced dementia. By her own description, her mother is hard of hearing, but they no longer place her hearing aids in her ears. She's blind with cataracts, but apparently no one will perform what is an 8-minute operation that doesn't even need general anaesthesia, and which they basically do in paddocks in developing nations to remove them. Her teeth have fallen out, but she hasn't been provided with dentures. And as a result, she can't eat solid food, she can't see, she can't hear, and so not surprisingly, she doesn't speak. Landvot describes her mother's nursing home as being staffed by overworked and underpaid care attendants. Residents suffer the humiliation of being placed on a toilet until there is, quote, action or until staff have time to return. People sit in front of the TV all day. Their only human contact is from carers spooning food into their mouths or nurses dispensing medicine. Their only physical contact. Singers, she says, entertain a room full of sedated residents who all sit there in couches with their mouths agape. Landvot writes, quote, "If she could see herself now sitting in front of daytime television with a tea towel for a bib, hair awry, no jewellery or makeup, bits of breakfast still in crumbs on her chair, and more detail I can't bear to write about, she would be disgusted. She would weep. We weep for her." But really, I read this and I thought, who's the person who's disgusted? She writes, quote, "When the things we live for are denied us, never to return, we should be assisted to depart." But who's denying this woman? Who's given up making the last months of her life bearable or dignified? And I think we have. We've allowed the indignity, not by prohibiting euthanasia, but by failing to value the elders who now need our care, the sort of care they gave to us when we were very young. And we leave the world as we entered it, needing assistance. In some cultures, children weren't named until they were 5 years old. They didn't enter personhood until then because the odds of surviving were quite low. We seem to have placed our elders in that same category, anonymous non-persons for whom death is never premature nor unexpected. I think if death becomes an option in the face of any sort of debility, then debility is sort of turned into a lifestyle choice. And lifestyle choices in our society are the responsibility of the individual, and our social responsibility is thus dissolved. Death currently consumes our discussions of how we might improve the life and the healthcare of the old. The literature is full to bursting of horrific depictions of overtreatment, to the point that one's led to believe that an agonising high-tech death is the fate of every old person stepping into the hospital. The way I'd read it, if I didn't actually work at a hospital, would be that your most pressing need is to find a way to protect yourself from doctors who are trying to rob you of your human right to die at every opportunity. Hospitals aren't elder-friendly. They precipitate delirium, malnutrition and deconditioning, but that's because no one has the time to talk to, walk with or feed the patients anymore, and families are pretty thin on the ground or completely disempowered by the institutions. Where are the lobby groups and working parties and parliamentary inquiries into this? What's the point, people say to me all the time. What's the point? What's another month or two worth? Isn't 3 days in hospital to treat a chest infection a complete waste of health dollars when the person only has 3 months left to live anyway? I ask you, give me 3 months of your life. Time, as you can imagine, often becomes increasingly precious as people grow old, not less precious. Just a few drips left and they'd like to catch every one of them. But we make negative assumptions about older people's quality of life. How much is time worth? And what are you willing to trade off for a little more of it? The demand for medical care and the willingness to pay for it in discomfort, hospitalisation, doctor's visits, etc., actually increases with age, even when the return on the investment, a little bit more life, might seem small to the young. Most old people, not all, but most, actually want to live, and most people requesting to be killed do so not because of unbearable physical pain, but because of hopelessness and a feeling of worthlessness. There are many types of suffering and there are many ways to intervene, but if an old person is suffering, our response has become death, of course. A good death, but still death. It's as if we see an old person, that's all we see, walking death. We see something we convince ourselves we'll never become, something we'd rather be dead than become, until we slowly make our way there. And it's funny how so many of us gradually change our mind. Sore joints, keep going. Short of breath, keep going. Can't go further than the letterbox, yeah, who cares? More interesting in here than out there anyway. Keep going. What's not so funny is that this is why we have such shitty nursing homes, stingy hospitals, and a widespread and utterly tolerated and uncommented on ageism. Is this unswerving focus on death when we speak of the situation of the elderly in our society an indication actually of our unconscious desire to be rid of them? If only those who promote mandatory advanced care directives and teach doctors to kindly withdraw care with a 5-step communication package spent as much time and resource on teaching them how they might improve a person's life, that someone's last years might have great value, that teeth and glasses and hearing aids and feeling the sun on your face and being off sedation is actually important, but someone old, still a named individual who will respond to touch and love, and most importantly, that we should interrogate our prejudices before we inflict our communication skills packages on any patient. I really don't think that the most urgent contraction of our elderly citizens' human rights is about keeping them alive against their living will. The young rule the world. We stomp around doling out mean rations to the old. The machinery of our secure, quiet bodies purring to us the myth that we'll be young forever, that we could never be like them. And one by one, my patients retreat to these small nursing home rooms and then slip away. And soon they'll all be gone, but the rooms won't be empty. It'll be your turn and mine to sit in cells and drink the weak cold tea they hand out at 11 and 2, hoarding brown biscuits in our fridges, not dead yet. That's it. Thanks.
As a socially progressive atheist who always thought that, yes, I'm like that guy you were talking about, sitting with his legs on the table, thinking 75 is probably a good age to go, maybe 85, maybe 90, but when I can't do it by myself anymore. But you've given me a lot to think about. I must say, thank you for that. It's been terrific. And here's one little question, and that is Stalin's gulags. Did you find out, and the cells in there, did you find any more out about that?
You know,
was it better than the nursing home?
I mean, obviously that I think really when I reflect on it now, that's what I was worried about. You know, what was it like for her, you know, where she was, this woman I'd come to know. I mean, I tried to ask her when I went to see her, but all she wanted to talk about was her son and his horrible wife who wouldn't let him play the violin. It's really, that's what she wanted to talk about. And I felt like a bully, sort of saying, but what did you eat? You know, so, you know, she got to choose what we spoke about, and that was what she wanted to talk. That was where her pain was at that time. So, no, my greedy curiosity wasn't satisfied, but it kind of was as well.
Following on from a couple of the points that you made, I'm struck by the difference both in the reporting and the coroner's report to the Senate inquiry on the end-of-life care on the suicide among the elderly as opposed to suicide among youth. What lessons do you think we can learn about youth suicide to address what could be seen as a crisis in the elderly suicide, but as you said?
Yeah, so the two peaks the two big groups who suicide in our society are young men and old men. And I think it's so interesting the way so young men commit suicide and we're like, oh my God, you know, we've got to fund this, make sure that we do everything we can, you know, within or at least pretend we are. And then, you know, old men committing suicide, and we go, we've got to help them commit suicide. I just think it's so extraordinary, as if it's rational to want to die if you're an 80-year-old bloke, but it's irrational to want to die when you're 18. And when you look at the studies, the reasons that people want to die when they're older are sort of the same as the reasons people want to die when they're younger. They just feel like shit, like nobody wants them, that they're worthless. Like you're empty. People commit suicide because they're empty, they feel worthless, they're angry with other people, and it's a way of sort of showing them. I think it's terrible that lonely old people who want to die, that our response is, yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think it's an argument for euthanasia, not at all. It's an argument for for us to, you know, pick up our game, try and attend to people's needs.
Do you think there's a contagion effect from the way that it is reported?
Completely. I think that I think that our constructions of old age as a time of, you know, decline and lack in productivity and, you know, of course you'd want to die, really does affect old people, you know, really does. I have patients on my ward who, and I say it so many times that I'm sick of hearing myself say it, who apologise constantly for taking up a bed, for being a burden on their family. Just yesterday I had a conversation with a woman, she's like, oh, I feel so bad, I'm here, I'm such a burden on my family, I'm such a whatever. I'm like, how many kids? 3. Remember when they were 2? You know, what did you do? Like, I bet you felt like they were a frigging burden on you, you know. It's your turn. You paid your taxes, you looked after them, relax. She's like, thank you, yes.
Karen, who do you think should provide medical oversight to nursing home residents, given that a high proportion of them have dementia and most of them have at least 3 or 4 or 5 serious, incurable medical diseases?
Who should provide medical care? So I guess leading question, you want me to say palliative care, I know, because we sat on a panel last week. Palliative care, okay, except as a general physician, I think I am a palliative care physician. Very few things do I cure. So, I mean, our whole separation between palliative and non-palliative, like what's palliative care? Palliative care is about treating symptoms and trying to maximise people's quality of life, and I do that with all of my patients. So I have a patient, they're not dying within the next 5 months or 1 year or whatever, but the medication that is going to extend their life has certain burdens, and it's all about balancing the burden of treatment with the the life outcome they're going to have, and you negotiate that with every patient. So I think that the people that should provide medical care to any patient that has multiple chronic diseases is somebody who can look at the whole patient and work out a way that you're going to treat them by. So for example, people who have advanced heart failure often have to go on fluid restrictions. So they're only allowed to drink 1.5 litres of any sort of fluid a day. And it's really difficult, and it's very intolerable for some patients. So, you know, if they drink more than that, then they're going to shorten their life. But it's like, well, you know, you can either have a longer life of misery or a slightly shorter life, and you can get to drink, you know, 5 glasses of cordial a day or whatever you like to drink. So I think it's somebody who can be flexible in their prescribing and their, negotiation of what the patient is able to tolerate.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk tonight. I wonder if you can comment on the changes in the responsibilities of families for their elderly and to what extent that has affected the nursing home population.
Yeah, so I think it's really culturally dependent, isn't it? So when you look at Japan, for example, you know, big tradition of families looking after their elderly parents, but then, as with most developed nations, children now move away to work, and so and they've come up with all of these, look, and I'm not an expert in this area, I just have read about it, but they've come up with all of these solutions that I think are better than what we have. So they have, just as we have a disability insurance, they have everybody pays a tax, and it goes towards funding individual in-home care for older people, and there's this exchange system where you look after your elderly neighbour and somebody back in your hometown looks after your elderly parent, etc. I think in Australia, yeah, I don't know. Some cultures within Australia are very dedicated to looking after their family member in their home, and I guess the overall impression of them from many people working in healthcare are that they're crazy. Like, this person has high-level nursing needs, and the family's looking after them, but. Look, I don't know, I always get attacked whenever I talk about this because they say, you're trying to make women do back-breaking work and not have a career and look after their family. People, when they get to that level of debility, don't tend to live very long. So I don't know, I don't mean to be prescriptive in any way, but I think that we need somehow to support families to look. We need some sort of state-run system to look after older people, obviously, because of the way our society is now. But some families look after their elderly parents beautifully and love them and care for them. I don't know if I.
Common humanity, there's a significant variation.
Yep, there is.
Well, just following on from that comment, and I'd also like to thank Karen very much for her lecture, but she knows I'm a fan of course.
Thanks, Mike.
I won't say anything more about her lecture because I work with her. But you've said, I think, so clearly in your talk, and it's buried in the talk, that were we to have the intent to look after, improve quality of life, to direct resources to these people, we could do an enormous amount with people even in their nursing homes. Music's one thing we haven't talked about. We could put musicians in there, lots of unemployed musicians around the place. They could go in and just change a day. We could put actors in there, they change a day, we put people and help them to dance, and it just would change their lives. But our whole perspective that you've so vibrantly, I think, presented to the community, is let's do the opposite. Let's leave them there and say their life is not worthwhile because, as you said, we've made their life not worthwhile. And
But no, the thing that's so remarkable about it, Mike, is that that's us. Like, that's what I can't get. Like, that is where we are going to. We are creating the conditions for how we're going to be cared for when we're old. There's this comedian from Byron Bay. She's this big, brash blonde named Mandy Nolan, and has got to be the funniest person I've ever met in my life. And she does work in nursing homes, and she talks about the first time she was ever hired, you know, as a stand-up comic. She was needing some money, so she goes and does this work in a nursing home, and she gets there and she's telling her jokes and she's getting nowhere. And she went home and she sort of tried to think about how she might connect with these people who had very short term memories only, you know, so it's like they're living in this continual present, which will be kind of good for a stand-up comic because you could just say the same joke over and over and it'd be like funny every time. But she came up with these things, and the things that she did were incredible. And she tells stories about people who haven't spoken for 2 years started talking, you know, these hugely demented residents dancing with each other, and it was really incredible. It was like she somehow found a way to engage with the residents on their terms and, you know, connect with them in a way that was meaningful for them. It was really incredible. We can definitely do better, but, you know.
Yeah, we need to badly understand that stuff and how people's brains can change even in this state. You gave me an idea when you were talking, Karen. We talk a lot about advanced directives, and you know, you come in with a little bit of paper that says this is what I want. Don't look at me, look at the paper, and then you can decide what to do with me. Really, really tough stuff. I thought maybe we could change that to advanced perspectives, and everyone could come in with their advanced perspective, which you might be able to template for us.
Advanced perspective.
Sort of swing around a little bit.
What? I don't understand. What do you mean? What would be an advanced perspective?
This is looking at a perspective that if you went around all our public hospitals,
Yeah.
I don't think you'd find a lot of this perspective in there.
Oh,
If you
advanced.
articulate it. I don't think so.
No, we're too busy trying to get everyone out of there.
That's right. That's why I think it's a bit advanced.
I think in one of the documentary promos, I think it raised the question that the Chinese government have or were going to introduce a law to make the children responsible or make some contribution to the care of their parents. Do you know much about it and you think it's a good idea? And secondly, when a person like myself and many others have done advanced care, is it actually respected in the hospital system, or do some family members put the pressure on that you've just wasted your time preparing them?
Okay, so the first question, never heard anything about what's happening in China, but it seems to me that it should just be a community thing. We should just be taxed and fund things properly. Like you can't, well, I'd make sure you had lots of children, I guess, if they're going to be forced to look after you, I don't know. So I've never heard of that. The advanced care plan thing, I think, so it's one piece of information that we use amongst many pieces of information. So if someone comes in with an advanced care plan that they've made 10 years ago, then obviously we're not going to just use that as gospel. We talk to the family, we talk to the patient if they're lucid, we talk to the GP, the nursing home, and you try and work out what might be the best thing to do. Really, I actually haven't found, lots of people have them and they're not really very helpful because they're not specific for a start. Secondly, if you're, say, have dementia and you're from a nursing home and you're 90 years old, demanding that you don't go to ICU, like there's no ICU in any public hospital that would take you anyway, like none at all. So the only time they really matter is if you were somebody for whom an intensive treatment would be offered. This is in general, so if you have a specific disease, I think that it's really relevant in things like people with cancer maybe, they want to... I have to say on my ward, 5% of our patients die. People with advanced care plans, really, yes, they would be read and would be countenanced and taken into consideration, but they would never ever be the only thing that you look at. And families are very important.
Could I just challenge that if someone has the legal sound mind, gone to a lot of trouble to indicate this is basically what I want, and half the time the family wouldn't know what they're doing. To me, I think from a legal point of view, that perhaps yourself and some of the others are letting people who have thought seriously about it, if you're going to be a vegetable or something.
Yeah, so that doesn't happen. Like that's completely irrelevant to hospital practice. There's no, we would never give treatment to someone who's going to be a vegetable, and that scenario that you just raised doesn't happen. That's the thing that you hear about in the media all the time, and that's the thing that everyone gets hysterical about. Never ever have I ever seen that happen. Never. It just doesn't exist. You shouldn't be worried. You should be worried that you're not going to be let in hospital, actually. You should be worried that you're not going to get treatment. You shouldn't be worried that you're going to be kept alive in ICU as a vegetable, despite your advanced care plan saying you don't want to be a vegetable. Like, it's just not going to happen. Like, seriously, it's really not going to happen. But yes, of course, if you write an advanced care plan, it will be read and it will be taken as serious.
This question's got a bit of a long preamble, so I hope you'll bear with me. My mother and my aunt both lived in a nursing home that is really not like what you described. And my dad was there too and nearly died. It's a really good nursing home, and it's probably as good as it can be. And if I had to go to a nursing home, I probably want to go there. But there's big buts. And yesterday I had a conversation with the manager of It's Low Care, their section, and she was describing, she's professional, caring, empathetic, she looks after them really, really well. But she told me she had an argument in the car park with my 99-year-old aunt because she wanted to go walk to the shops. And she's done that, you know, weekly ever since she's been there. She's quite fit. But in the last sort of 12 months, she started expressing that it's getting a bit much for her, and she's had 3 unexplained falls in 2 months. So everyone's starting to hover and, you know, wrap her up. And she's saying, oh, I don't really want to keep walking, but on the other hand, yes, I do want to keep walking. So, you know, you said, what do nursing homes think is the point? What is their goal? And it seems to me that they're all about risk management.
Yeah, I agree.
And so the question, finally, is how do we detach the duty to care for older people, to care for their health and their well-being, but how do we detach that from depriving them of the right to take risks? Because the risk management is about, you know, the role is to keep them safe in the way that we keep children in kindergarten safe. You know, stop
Unless she's competent. So if she's...
It wasn't a legal issue.
No, but it's an ethical issue. So is she of sound mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, well then it's her choice. This comes up in the hospital all the time. So people say they're unsafe to go home, and they're saying, I just want to go home. Like if I die, I die. Just let me go home.
Everyone have walkers is all about risk management as well. You know, I think personally, from observation now over several years, that you're better off to resist the walker as long as you can. Your balance will be much better, your walking will be much stronger. But in the nursing home, even if you can manage without a walker, they'll encourage you to have one just in case.
Just in case, yeah. I think it's an issue. I don't know the answer, but I would always err on the side of letting the person take, if they're competent, if she wants to walk to the shop and risk her life, if she gets a broken hip, then probably she'll die.
Well, that's the issue, does she, you know, it's that thing about, she is competent, but in a kind of a narrow range.
Yeah, so competency is all about that one question. So they don't have to be competent universally. It's just about that. So does she understand what the risk is of walking to the shop? Does she understand what the consequences would be if she were to have an accident? If the answer is yes, then I think that absolutely she's not a child. She's a 99-year-old woman and should be able to take that risk. But it's easy for me to say here, I don't even know her. She's some abstract 99-year-old.
But the risk management issue is also institutional. So say she took the walk and she has the fall, then it comes back on the person managing, you know, of how did you let this happen? So we're so risk averse now at a kind of institutional level as well. So there's that issue too.
Well, there should be a way perhaps to document, have a family meeting, document she's allowed to walk to the shop and we take the risk. We do that all the time for people who want to eat and they can't swallow properly and they might aspirate, but they'd rather die than not be able to eat. So, you know, you have a meeting and you write it in the notes and that gets past the risk.
I'm sorry, I have to let someone else ask.
What? I'm sorry, I can't answer clearly.
My question follows on from that actually. You're using expressions like sound mind and competent. I'm interested in how you talk with elderly people. Many elderly people might well have some short-term memory loss. They may well be facing issues or questions that they haven't faced at other times of their life. They may well feel they're a burden to their family. They may well be in pain and distress and so on. So the conversation you have with them might be very different from the conversation you might have with someone in a very different cultural, medical, whatever set of circumstances. So I'm puzzled when you say, is she of sound mind? Because if she did have short-term memory loss, would you rule?
Oh, I'd still think she could be in. Oh no, of course not. I've got short-term memory loss.
How you talk to an elderly person?
Well, it depends on the elderly person. How do I talk? There's not one elderly Paul. That's such a loaded question. You know what the answer is. It's not. There wouldn't be. What I can tell you is how I don't say we're going to rehab. We're going to take some antibiotics. You're so cute. Like how do I talk to? It depends on what sort of background they're from, what socioeconomic status they're from, what their mood is like, what their problem is. I just try and talk to them like a human being. Not. I think that the thing that I see that riles me up the most is that condescending tone of voice that you hear all the time, like you're applying your empathetic skills that you've learned how to do in medical school, like, this like robotic 5 things: lean forward, use a bright tone of voice, call them by their first name. Look, when I say of sound mind, I mean, is she like floridly psychotic? Obviously, short-term memory loss to me doesn't mean you're the person who taught me that competence is not a global thing. It's just about that one decision. So that one decision, do you want to go home? These are the consequences that you might face. That's it. If they understand that, then that's their choice. I mean, I would always err on the side of letting that person determine their future, always. Do I pass?
I'm just interested in hearing views on the opportunities of relating to people differently once someone has dementia. So I've just had 5 days caring for Mum, and it was a bit shocking to realise that the complete short-term memory loss and memories only starting 45 years ago, but at the same time it was actually really cool thinking, what can we do as a family to make it good for her? And the thing that was good was a lot of activity and a lot of things like doing a lot of stuff, because sitting around having cups of tea thinking, what can I ask about? Everything I ask about is like a booby trap, because Mum will try and compensate for not remembering.
Yeah.
So I'd be really interested, like given that you're working with old people all the time and I'm basically not, and we're still recovering from how knackered we were after 5 days of it. Like, I need help. Like, we need help. My family needs help to know how to be differently with someone who is different, her intelligence is intact, but her memory is screwed. Like it's just she doesn't remember anything. Like she's got all that sharpness. Like we went to the Dago exhibition and she was analysing everything right there, much better than me.
Well, you don't need my advice. I need your advice. That's fantastic. It sounds like you're doing exactly the right thing. You just have to.
The sense of humour was there. Like one of my kids was like, Mum said, "Oh, was there once the camp?" And she goes, "I've told you 100 times," and then Mum could see he was laughing. It was really cool.
Yeah, well, kids, Dagar, what activities, your family around you, I reckon that's perfect.
Long term though.
Yeah, I mean, it's very challenging to hear that.
I might actually ask Paul to answer that, if that's all right, because he cared for his mother. Sorry, Paul, but you did come. He cared for his mother who had advanced dementia for a long time, and I know that he's done a lot of work in this area. So, over to you.
That's a really dirty trick.
I know.
I really sympathise with that very deep comment and your observations. And that, in a sense, was what was behind my question. That it's important not to dismiss people because there's some level of what we refer to technically as cognitive impairment. We don't engage with people on the basis only of their cognitive abilities, their cognitive capacities. And in fact, to some extent, as you've described, there's a creativity that comes from what we refer to so disparagingly as dementia. It's also a disruption, and it can be a rediscovery. And as it has been for you yourself, so it's not just for the person who's affected, but for the entire family. You've discovered things about your relationship with your mother and your relationships with your sisters and so on. And this will be a very profound time that lives with you for the rest of your lives and maybe your children's lives if you have children and so on. So we need to rethink the whole concept of dementia. We need to stop thinking about people who lose their cognitive capacity as being somehow null people, who don't have competency, who are no longer of sound mind, whose wishes no longer count. We've got to find new ways of talking to them, of listening to them, of being able to pick up those subtle little signs that you've been able to pick up so you can engage with them in a new and fresh way.
There's somebody.
I just had two quick questions. One, do you think at some point in the future we'll look back at progressive support for euthanasia now the way we look at progressive support for eugenics? And secondly, do you think that our sort of societal attitude towards ageing is somehow wrapped up with the sort of broader acceptance of like a disposable culture?
The first question, I haven't thought of that, but yeah, I think it's pretty shameful, and it's sort of, it's like the one thing that's counter to every progressive ideal, really. You know, I thought the fundamentals of progressive ideology or politics is that sometimes the individual sacrifices a couple of rights for the greater good, like, for example, part of your pay packet, you know? And so, and that you care for people who are not in high wage earners or something like that. But so I don't know, eugenics, was that a progressive thing? It's amazing, I didn't know that. And the second question was?
Disposable culture, if our attitude to ageing is sort of wrapped up in that same sort of idea.
Yeah, I don't know, I haven't thought of that either. They're interesting. I'll have to think about them and get back to you in like a month. My mind's not very fast. I don't know. I reckon it's caught up in our neoliberal culture, actually. And also on a sort of an individual, our complete denial, our love of youth and, you know, work and making money and being powerful. And I just hear so many junior doctors, for example, just say, I am never going to get like that. I'm going to take my granddad's insulin when I get like that. I'm going to, you know, I'm never, people just think they're never ever going to be like that. So we're, you know, that's why we don't really do anything about it, or that we're going to knock ourselves off before we ever get like that. So there's this complete denial of, you know, the fact that actually most of us, when we start to get old, are just going to be like, I want to keep going.
Would you mind meeting Britt halfway? I feel awful. Let's do that.
I just wanted to ask that, following on from that about the neoliberal culture, do you think the fact that aged care facilities are more and more run as for-profit businesses makes it impossible to effect that cultural change that is necessary?
I think any kind of care is completely incommensurate with privatised for-profit thing. Like, you know, it completely wipes out the ethical basis that should be the, you know, the bedrock of the interaction. Completely. Same with private hospitals. Once you need to make, they're going, people who have a for-profit hospital or aged care facility, they no longer work for to make the life of their patients or residents better. They work to make a profit for the shareholders. Like, it's just, seriously, it doesn't take a genius. Yeah.
I just have a couple of questions. The first one is, what does palliative care actually involve? And the second one is, how would you distinguish euthanasia from physician-assisted suicide? Okay,
so the second question, there's no difference. It's all a doctor killing a patient. So it's all just euphemisms. So there's no difference at all. I don't think there's a difference. Like, you give, when I prescribe a drug to a patient and give them the script, I take complete responsibility for that patient. That is a recommendation. It's not a take this if you want to take this, and nothing to do with me. So there's no difference actually when it comes down to it. And the first one, what is palliative care? So there's lots of different aspects to palliative care, but so at my hospital or in a hospice, palliative care is a multidisciplinary team. So it's a doctor, they'd have nurses, psychologists, social workers, like it's a team of people who attend to the physical, psychological, social, family, spiritual, if they're that way inclined, needs of a person in the last stages of their life, and tries to make them comfortable. So we can have that, or we can have that. There you go, here's a script. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation, it's fabulous.
Coming.
I was going to ask you, because a lot of the stuff that you're talking about sounds like a return to community engagement and civil society, and you're talking about neoliberalism, so there's a whole lot of factors that you're kind of touching on. I'm just wondering, have we come too far to return to that point? And I guess my sister and I are carers for my dad, and we are long-term carers, and we're committed to that. One of the things that we're finding at the moment is that trying to seek respite for dad who has higher needs is really difficult, because they will take people with low needs, but not high needs. So it kind of leaves us in a difficult position of thinking we're going to have to think some way of actually finding some way of recovering, not getting too fatigued, so that we can't look after dad, because the assumption is that at some point dad will go to hospital. That's not our assumption, but that's what we're continually up against. So yeah, I don't know, what are the critical factors that could actually create that change?
Have we come too far, do you think? I reckon we have. I've completely lost hope, actually, just quietly. I know. No, I really have. And it might be that I'm in the middle of a really long stint of ward service in a really, hospitals overflowing and, you know, rationing and, look, I really do, I don't know, a revolution, hopefully. There's going to be a tipping point where, you know, the 1%, the 99% go bugger you, and I don't know, no. I'm really sorry for your situation. It would be so good to support, and in fact it would make economic sense in the big picture to support you and your sister looking after your father, but we don't. You know, in the UK, in the NHS, I read that you can get a nurse to come 6 times a day. That's what they do to support. It's not a very long visit, but can you imagine 6 times a day? Here's your medicine, here's a shower, here's some toast and tea. It really helps people stay at home. And it's overall, you save money doing that, but I think there's lots of barriers. The first would be Commonwealth state funding divisions and et cetera, et cetera. It's all very, beyond my, understanding. I really don't understand all of that, but I think there's heaps of barriers. But the main one is the lack of people really giving a damn. Yeah.
25 hours at home.
A week?
A year.
A year. 25 hours a year. It's not even enough time to get your hair cut enough. Yeah. Terrible. I'm so sorry. Yeah. And hi, because I know you.
Okay, so I don't believe that someone who speaks with the passion that you've spoken with has given up hope. So you don't have to be distressed.
Be distressed.
An old Spanish saying is that if you want to become invisible, there's nothing easier. Just become poor, and if that fails, wait till you get old. And I want to thank Karen for movingly describing what partly that is true, the second part of that is true, partly why it's true, and what the conditions of visibility might be. Often, when I praise people in these lectures highly, I then wonder at the end of the lecture whether the audience agrees with me or not. And sometimes I think some do, some don't. I'm absolutely certain that nobody disagrees with what I said about Karen at this lecture. And I've seen the faces, and I've seen how moved you've been, and rightly have been. So I want you to thank her very much.